Hey, I just saw a video from Derrick over on Veritasium, which had an interesting thought experiment about Sleeping Beauty and some coin flips. If you haven't already seen that video, go ahead and check out the link in the description, or feel free to watch this video and be completely lost. Either one's good with me. Um, anyway, in this thought experiment, they take a woman, Sleeping Beauty, and they put her to sleep, and then they flip a coin. If it's heads, they wake her up once, ask her whether or not the coin flip was heads or tails, and then put her back to sleep. If it's tails, they wake her up, ask her whether or not the coin flip was heads or tails, and put her back to sleep, and then they do it again the next day, only if it's tails. So they do it twice in a row if it's tails. The trick, of course, being that she doesn't get to remember what has happened on a previous day. So she can't just say, this is the second time you've asked me this question. Obviously, it's tails. And then the question is, well, what should Sleeping Beauty say? Well, the obvious answer is she shouldn't pick heads or tails. Some crazy people have come in here, drug her away from her home, and forced her to sleep, and then is potentially messing with her memory. She should do whatever the heck she wants to do. She should mess with the experiment in any way possible, right? Obviously, that's not necessarily in the spirit of a thought experiment. And you might think that not picking is a bit of a facetious answer, and it's kind of trying to avoid the problem. But actually, I think it does get to the heart of the problem fairly well, and in fact, provides a, second interesting look at what could be a valid, correct answer for the thought experiment. But we'll get to that last part in a second. We'll come back to it. The first thing that she should mess with the experiment. The reason that that's kind of actually an interesting look at it is because in the original thought experiment, we aren't given any motivation for Sleeping Beauty. Why would she say heads or tails? And this kind of serves to confuse the question in general. Without any motivation, we can't actually say what Sleeping Beauty should say. We have to inject our own motivation onto Sleeping Beauty. Generally, in these thought experiments, the person in the thought experiment is considered to be acting in a perfectly reasonable, logical manner to reach some sort of goal, generally stated in the problem. In this particular problem, it's not stated. So we have to inject our own desires or our own motivation onto Sleeping Beauty. The most obvious one being, I want to be correct as often as possible. So if we choose that motivation, then we end up at the obvious answer that Sleeping Beauty should say tails. Because, there's a 50-50 chance it's heads or tails, but heads is only worth one correct value. Tails is worth two correct values, right? It'd be like if you went to some sort of casino and, there's a 50% chance of roulette landing on red and a 50% chance on black, but for some reason the payout for black was twice as much. Of course you're going to bet on black. Why would you not bet on black? So that's one of the obvious motivations you could give to Cinderella. But then in the video, we immediately transfer to the question, what are the odds that they flipped heads? Now this is kind of a strange follow-up question, especially if you came in with a motivation of being correct more often than not, because the odds of it being heads or tails doesn't actually impact the answer. Yeah, the odds of it being heads was 50-50 on any given day that she woke up. Or maybe you're not convinced of that yet, but hopefully you're convinced of the fact that it doesn't matter, because even if there is only a 50-50 chance on each day, if she consistently says tails, she's got a 50% chance of getting, 2 points, right? Whereas if she says heads, there's only a 50% chance of getting 1 point. Because again, we've kind of arbitrarily assigned her the motivation of being correct as often as possible. Now, if instead we kind of looked at it as what are the odds, or what should she say to be correct at least once? Now the odds of it being heads or tails is more important, because we're not trying to get correct as often as possible, just once. And there was an original coin flip. It's either heads or tails. If you give the same answer every single time you wake up, and, maybe you're starting to see ahead here, but we'll get back to that too. If you give the same answer every time you wake up, there's a 50-50% chance that you are right at least once, because it's either heads or tails. And that's kind of, I think, where we get this weird split in the people trying to, answer this secondary question that was posed of what are the odds. And I think personally, I'm in the half-her camp, I guess, and also in the camp that she should probably say tails. But let's go ahead and take a deeper look at this other question that we mentioned earlier. What if she wants to be correct at least once? Because I think that's more interesting. And it's kind of closer to what it feels like we're trying to get to with that original question of what are the odds we flipped heads? Which, again, is a completely separate problem, and I think that's what's confusing people on this issue for the most part, because the motivation that I chose for Sleeping Beauty was, be correct as often as possible, and then the answer is trivially she should say tails. And then we get into, is it 1/2 or 1/3? And it kind of tricks you like, well, 1/3 is the group that says tails, 1/2 is the group that says, who cares? I was in the tails camp, so I must believe 1/3. Anyway, so I think that's generally the problem with the question. But if instead we move the motivation to Cinderella wants to be correct at least once, then we can not pick and get a better than 50-50 odds. What do I mean by that? Well, if when you wake up Cinderella, she just flips a coin and then says whatever side that face lands on, then she has a 50% chance to be correct on any given day. So if it flipped heads, then her odds of also flipping heads and getting that correct is overall 50%. You got a 50% chance of getting the 50% odds correct. That's a 25% chance. Now, the tails, on the other hand, is more interesting because you actually get 2 chances to be correct about tails. It happens 2 times after all. So we've got our 25% chance of being correct from heads, but if it flipped tails, the odds of us flipping heads twice in a row and being wrong is 25%, right? So our odds of getting tails and being correct at least once is 75%. Now we've got 75% of a 50% chance, which gives us 3 out of 8 times, right? We're going to get tails right most of the time if it's tails. So 3 out of 8 times it was tails and we got it correct. 1/4 of the time it was heads and we were correct. Again, that's a 50% chance of the 50% chance, which you could also say as 2/8. So that's 5/8 total odds of you being correct at least once if instead of picking heads or tails, as the question kind of implies you should, you don't pick and instead let chance decide for you. The video is getting a little long, so I'm not going to go into whether or not you should use a coin or a dice or what the best odds are on that, because that's kind of interesting as well. But I'm going to end it here. So that was my thought on the thought experiment posed over at Veritasium by Derrick. I thought it was interesting, very thought-provoking. Hopefully you also got your brain spinning because of it. Anyway, this has been Josh. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.